Good afternoon. Sorry to interrupt lunch, but welcome to Conversations on Children's Health. My name is Mike Anderson. I am a pediatric intensive care physician, and I am 1 year in now to being the president of UCSF Benioff Children's Hospitals. How a year can fly. Oh, thank you very much. Oh, that was not an applause line, but thank you very much. It's now my honor to introduce the Chief Medical Officer for UCSF Benioff Children's Hospitals. Dr. David Duran is a neonatologist. He's a local. He trained at Oakland Children's, has been on the neonatal staff for quite some time, and now I'm proud to call him a friend and a member of our cabinet. So, Dr. Duran, thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Let me start by echoing something that Mike said. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here, for being part of this conversation around children's health. I also want to echo what Mike said about the importance of the direction that we're going to take today. A lot of us think about what we do as a children's hospital as providing inpatient care. You're sick, you come into the hospital. You're injured, you come into the emergency room. You have ongoing care needs, you come into the clinic. In that arena, what we do is we train the caretakers of the future, the physicians, the nurses, the social workers, the therapists. But very, very importantly, we're also dedicated to putting ourselves out of business fundamentally. Our basic goal is to learn how to prevent disease, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I spent most of my career in newborn intensive care, taking care of babies in the NICU at Oakland. And during my many years, I guess I should say decades, we've seen the conversations around what impacts children's health and later adult health change. During the first part of my career, we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the impacts of neonatal diseases. What does the neonatal condition do to later childhood and eventually to later disease, to adult disease? In the last few years, we've really seen that conversation changing more and more to the fetal origins of disease, talking about what are the things that happen in utero or even prenatally in the environment, preconception in the environment, that will impact not only a child's health but eventually adult health. So we're going to focus on that today as this part of our series on Conversations on Health, talking about toxic stress and environmental stress, two very important things. You know, we live in a world where we're surrounded by a lot of stuff. We're surrounded by the pollution that comes from the cars. We're surrounded by industrial pollution. We worry when we have something like the fires that devastated the area north of us in terms of what did that air quality, which changed for a couple of weeks, what did that do to us? We see it throughout our culture, throughout our cities and counties. Recently, San Francisco with a ban on decreasing toxic chemicals in making furniture. So we're going to kick this off today. We have two speakers. The first of them is Dr. Tracy Woodruff. Dr. Woodruff has an interesting background. She's in the world of environmental health. She spent 15 years at the EPA and now functions at that interface between environmental health and maternal biology. And so to kick us off and talk about some environmental issues and fetal and maternal health, Dr. Tracy Woodruff. Tracy.
Good afternoon. If you had a child with cancer, I think you heard already, you're all here because you love UCSF, and UCSF has the best treatment. If you had a child with cancer, you would come to UCSF because you wanted the best treatment for that child. And the thing is, as we've seen in the video, we've had the two eminent physicians here talk about, we've had great advances in the ways that we can treat this disease. But we have a challenge, and that is that while we have made advances in treating disease, the challenge is our children are getting sicker. So we've seen an increase in childhood cancer over the last 30 years. Childhood leukemia has gone up 35%, as well as brain cancers. There's been a doubling of asthma. Now about 8%, almost 10% of children have asthma. We've seen increases in ADHD and autism. Like 8 of 46 boys have autism. We've seen increases in obesity and diabetes, all in a time period that cannot be explained by genetics. So there must be something externally that is influencing these childhood diseases. And that is our challenge for the future, is to identify those and address those so that we can prevent children from getting into the disease pipeline. So I'm going to talk about industrial chemicals. So this is one factor that has increased greatly in the United States since post-World War II. We've seen over a 15-fold increase in the production and manufacturing of industrial chemicals. That's another way to say it's environmental pollution. These are all code words for things that are manufactured and used in so many of the things that we come into contact with in our daily life. So Teflon-like chemicals, which are in pots and pans and fabrics. Flame retardant chemicals, which were somewhat alluded to. I'll talk a little bit more about those, which are found in furniture and mattresses. We have plasticizers like phthalates, which are found in plastic materials, BPA, which are found in the lining of can. These are all chemicals that probably you've heard a little bit about, but the thing is that we're seeing more of them. And I like to show the statistic because it's, even for me, who I have worked in this field for over 20 years, I found this extremely surprising, is that there are 30,000 pounds per person of these chemicals produced in the United States. That's like having 5 elephants, each of us having 5 elephants. That'd be a lot of elephants in here, right? That's a lot of chemicals that are being used all around us. And the thing is, we're exposed to these chemicals in a variety of different ways. So there's pollution in the air we breathe, in the water we drink, in the food we eat, in the many different types of products that we use every day. So personal care products, shampoos, lotions, cleaning products, the materials that are used in our house, they're all surrounding us. And so the challenge is that because they are produced in such vast quantities and they are used in so many places, it's inevitable that we are exposed to these industrial chemicals. So this is from a study that we did a few years ago, looking at what are the chemicals that are present in pregnant women across the United States. And what we found was that virtually every pregnant woman in the United States is exposed to dozens of industrial chemicals, the ones I just talked about, so the Teflon-like chemicals, the flame retardants, the plasticizers, the air pollutants, all can be measured with our sort of new technology in biological samples like blood and urine. And the sad reality is that the placenta does not act as a barrier to these pollutants, and so the fetus is exposed even before the baby is born. This is a quote from the National Cancer Institute from a report that they put out a few years ago, where they said that to a disturbing extent, the baby is born pre-polluted. And you heard a little bit about why this is so important, and in part because the time from conception during the prenatal period and childhood is a time of great growth and changes, right? A lot of biological factors are both being established and developed, and these are things that are unique windows that never occur any other time in life. So it's a little bit like imagining two people dancing. These orchestrated biological factors happen, and if you interrupt that, you can have a permanent change that can alter the trajectory of development permanently. Now, maybe you won't see that right away. Maybe you'll see it in some of these childhood diseases we talked about, and some of them you won't even see until adulthood. And so this is what we are concerned about: understanding, identifying, and preventing. So I want to talk about, because you'll hear a lot about medical factors and environmental chemicals. Like, how does chemicals stack up with some of the other factors that we study in terms of relationship to childhood diseases? So this is a study that was done looking at the contributions to childhood IQ. And IQ is a measure of, not only a measure of intelligence, but it's also a marker for the brain health of that child. And what this study showed was that socioeconomic, nutritional, and social factors, some of them are deficiencies in diet, and we'll be hearing more about that from Dr. Boyce, can contribute around 15 million points in IQ. Medical conditions, so here's what UCSF has a premier NICU unit. I was talking to Dr. Duran about the premature infants. Those premature infants are at risk for future neurodevelopmental effects. Estimates are around 35 million. Neurodevelopmental disorders, this is your autism and ADHD, also around 40. But environmental factors are a similar contribution to effects on neurodevelopment, around 40 million. This is lead, a well-known neurodevelopmental toxin that kids are still being exposed to. Chlorpyrifos, which you may not know, but that's a pesticide that's widely used nationally. This was the pesticide that was going to be banned by EPA before the new administration, and then Administrator Pruitt came in and decided that there wasn't quite enough science to ban this, but the state of California just declared this a neurodevelopmental toxicant and methylmercury. So this is, these environmental factors can be as an important contribution to some of these childhood diseases as other medical conditions that we study and work on. So one other fact about industrial chemicals is compared to something else that's also small and manufactured that we have in commerce, which are pharmaceutical drugs. So if you have a drug, there's laws in the United States that require that that drug go through testing for safety, safety meaning it's safe to give to the patient, as well as efficacious, that it will actually work on the disease that you're treating. Just so you know, manufactured chemicals, which is kind of the cousin of pharmaceuticals, do not have to go through safety testing before they are used in any of your products. So if you go to the store and you buy a product on the shelf, you can't know whether it's been tested for safety because there's no law in the United States that requires complete safety testing for those chemicals. So this is the part where I have to pause because by this time people are like, oh my God, this is so depressing. So it's understandable that this can make you a little grumpy, but that's why I want to talk about the fact that we can actually do something. This thing that's so exciting about working on this, despite the fact that it does look a little Armageddon out there, but is that we can actually do something about it. If we identify the exposures, we remove them from the environment, we can actually decrease exposures to these chemicals and have a positive impact on health. Lead is a perfect example. Lead was in gasoline from the 1920s to the 1970s. And you know what? EPA took it out of gasoline, and now lead has gone down for children in the United States at levels that were unbelievable back in the 1970s. So it is possible to have a difference. And these are estimates from the state of California showing that you can get improvements in health for cancer, ADHD, neurodevelopmental outcomes, and asthma anywhere from, these are, I would say, conservative estimates, 10 to 30%. So this is something that we are doing at our program at the Reproductive Health and the Environment at UCSF is we study those sources of exposure in industrial chemicals. We identify where they are, how we recruit pregnant women, understand their exposures and how those are affecting development, and we're actually going to be following the kids up to childhood. But we know that doing science is just one part of the equation because we have a lot of scientific information. What we want to do is move to the doing part of this equation. So we also take that scientific information and we use it to make actionable changes that will move the needle to prevent these exposures and thereby improve child health. So one of the things, it's no, this is challenging times to be in the field of science because there's a lot of discussion about whether we believe scientific facts or not, but we are doubling down on science because that is the way that we know that things are true, and that's how we're going to figure out what the best and most efficient ways are to address these problems. So we are working with UCSF, has been very stand up about speaking up in various venues about defending science. We also are going to Washington, D.C. to talk about science, why chemicals matter, why they matter for children's environmental health. But we're also taking the facts and we give them out at an individual level. I have, because by the end of this time of the talk, people are like, want to ask me a lot of questions about what they personally can do. So we have put together these brochures that are tips about how you can reduce your own personal chemical exposures, but we give these out to every pregnant patient that comes to a UCSF clinic. So every pregnant mom has in her hands the ability to have some control of her own personal environment. And then we go to the place where people make decisions that influence our health. Like I said in the lead and gasoline, you wanted to not be exposed to lead and gasoline. That would be impossible until the government took it out of gasoline. So we go to DC and we work with clinicians to get them to go to DC to speak up on behalf of you and your families. And this is a quote from Dr. Jeannie Connery, who is the president of the OBGYN Professional Society. That's a professional society that represents obstetricians in the United States. And they have been, through our work with them, have been very active on promoting environmental reproductive health, and her quote here is, "We must shift the burden of proof from the individuals," that's us, "to the manufacturers before these chemicals are released in the environment." And it's a trajectory that we're moving along, but we think that the recognition by both physicians, UCSF, and yourselves is an important part of this process. But we also speak about it in venues, and I just want to follow up on what Dr. Duran said. We participated in the recent hearings that San Francisco held on a ban for flame retardant chemicals in any furniture coming into the city, being sold in the city of San Francisco. Flame retardant chemicals, that's one of the ones that everyone's exposed to. It also, we have shown from our studies, can influence brain development. This is two of our scientists, Dr. Vina Singla and Dr. Maria Zlatnik, who's a clinician at UCSF, testifying on this ban, talking about our science, and talking about why the ban is going to be important for the citizens of San Francisco. And I'm happy to report that it was passed recently. So now, if you buy your furniture in San Francisco, it has to be flame retardant free. It is a small step, but it is part of the steps that we're taking to knit together the science along with the actions that we're going to need so that we can reduce these environmental burdens of disease to improve the health of you, your families, and your children's families in the future. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Tracy. I'm sure people have questions. If everybody will hang on to their questions, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end of this after Dr. Boyce presents. So with that, I'd like to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Tom Boyce. Tom has spent some 40 years as a developmental pediatrician, both as a clinician and as a teacher and as a researcher. He's currently the Chief of Developmental Behavioral Pediatrics at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospitals. He's going to be talking about some of his work in the area that interrelates neurobiology, environmental stress, and developmental and behavioral outcome in young children. So, Tom.
Good afternoon to everybody. I'm really happy to be here and to be able to share with you some of my pride in being part of the UCSF faculty and having spent many of the 40 years, really the majority of the 40 years, in University of California institutions. In fact, I was trained here as a pediatrician like 45 years ago. I met my wife in the old UCSF library when she was a nurse practitioner student. My daughter Amy, who is now an RN, works at Benioff Children's Hospital, Oakland, across the bay. And I have 4 grandchildren that vary in size from this to about this, and they all wear UCSF t-shirts. So I have as thorough a pedigree with UCSF as most people there do. So Dr. Woodruff has told you something about the work that's being done at the university that has to do with exposures to the physical environment and to these pollutants and toxins that are so formative in the development of young children. But we do not stop with just the thoughts about the physical environment. We also want to address and think about the kinds of exposures within the social environment that also occur in children's lives, beginning with the relationship of the fetus to the mom, that physical and emotional connection that begins even during gestational life and then following birth becomes exponentially large as the lattice work of social relationships begins to build and children feel the effect of the kind of social environments in which we rear them. So my work at UCSF has been focused on children and young families facing major trauma and adversity. Let me start this by asking you, inviting you to do a thought experiment with me. If we, as we're doing a thought experiment, if all of us smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, everybody in the society smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, so it was uniformly a risk factor for lung disease, we might reasonably believe and surmise that lung cancer is a genetic disease because all of the variation in lung cancer incidence from one person to another would be due to genetic susceptibility. This universal exposure to tobacco smoke would create a situation where all of the variation from one person to another in the incidence of lung cancer would be due to aspects of genetic susceptibility. So what this means is that and of course, we don't have a society where everybody smokes 3 packs of cigarettes a day, but what it points to is the reality that the health risk factors that are most difficult to detect are those that are most common and the most prevalent. Even things as ubiquitous as stress and adversity are difficult to find, and we have been delayed in identifying them as causes of disease and disability because of the prevalence within the society. So we thankfully do not have an epidemic of cigarette smoking among young children, but what we do have is an epidemic of childhood trauma and adverse events. So what do I mean by these adverse events, these so-called toxic stressors? These are things like physical, emotional, sexual maltreatment, parental divorce, intimate partner violence or community violence to which children are exposed, parental incarceration, substance abuse, single unsupported parenthood, parent mental illness, poverty and unemployment, the death of a parent or a caretaker, and natural disasters like earthquakes and the experience that we had with the Sonoma fires just recently. Now, all of these, to be sure, are not guarantees that there is going to be some dire consequence in the lives of children. There are plenty of children who were brought up by single parents who do just fine. There were plenty of children who were exposed to those fires in Sonoma who are doing just fine as well. But these are risk factors that are so ubiquitous that we have tended to overlook them in past years. And in fact, we now know that 2/3 of children and adolescents have experienced a potentially traumatic event or major adversity by the age of 15. 2/3. That's one of the most prevalent risk factors to health that we know of. We also know that exposure to these kinds of adversities and toxic stressors differ significantly by socioeconomic status. So children who are being brought up in poverty compared to children who are being brought up in advantaged middle-class families have great differentials in terms of their exposures to these kinds of events and adversities that we're concerned with. If we look at children growing up in poverty versus middle-income families and compare their exposures to extreme housing density, other housing problems, noise in the ambient environment, family turmoil, and violence, in every situation, in every one of these kinds of exposures, those children who grow up in poverty have substantially more exposure than children being brought up in advantaged communities. Now, these exposures, we know increasingly, have profound effects on the nervous system and on the neurodevelopment of young children. We know that the 2 principal stress response systems in the human brain are the cortisol system, which is responsible for the output of cortisol, one of the major stress hormones, and the fight-or-flight system, the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for the whole fight-or-flight response under conditions of adversity. And we know that when these 2 stress systems are activated, that there are profound immunologic, cardiovascular, metabolic effects that have real influence on the incidence of disease and developmental failure. So if we look at children exposed to these kinds of adversities, we know that they have more in the way of infections, they're injured more often, they have stunning of growth, they show developmental delays, they're more at risk for mental disorders, chronic diseases, academic failure as they reach the teenage years, and substance abuse. All of these different morbidities that we very much want to prevent in the lives of our young people are tremendously increased by the activation of these stress response systems. However, it is also the case that kids vary tremendously in their responsivity or reactivity in those brain stress response systems to exposures to adverse and supportive environments. So we know, for example, that when we bring children into the lab and test them to see how reactive they are in those two stress response systems, the cortisol system and the fight or flight system, we know that about 80% of children have only modest reactions to the kind of laboratory challenges that we present to them. And interestingly enough, these are the 80% of children who, when they experience something like poverty or the death of a parent or fires in their hometown, these are the children who are resilient to those kinds of adverse events. The Swedes have an interesting neologism for this. It's called Maskrosbarn. It means dandelion child. So we have come to think of these children as like dandelion children. Like the dandelion, they are able to grow and flourish in all of the different environments to which they're exposed. Dandelions can grow in the cracks of sidewalks. They can grow in fertile mountain fields. They grow anywhere. And there are children who, like dandelions, can flourish in all but the most severely adverse environments. There are, however, 20% of kids who, when we bring them into the lab and we expose them to challenges and look at their cortisol and fight or flight systems, show dramatic responses biologically to those challenges. And what we find with these children, who we now are calling orchid children in contrast to the dandelion child, these are children who, under conditions of adversity, do not very well at all. They are profoundly more apt to develop infections, chronic disease, mental disorder, developmental delays, and so on. However, the good news about these orchid children, these so-called orkidebarn in Swedish, is that when they are reared in positive, supportive, nurturing environments, they do better than everybody else. They even do better than these dandelion children who are 80% of the population. So these are the children who have either the best or the worst of the outcomes, depending upon the kind of social environment into which they are born. Now, the most interesting recent finding, I believe, is a synthesis of what Dr. Woodruff was talking to you about and what I've been talking to you about, which is that we find that there are actually synergistic effects of toxic chemicals like exposures to pesticides among farm worker children and adverse social environments like maternal depression. The work of Brenda Eskenazi over at UC Berkeley has recently shown that the combination of these physical and psychosocial adversities together have profound effects on IQ at age 7, with children exposed to both the physical toxin and the toxic stress environment having much lower IQ at age 7 compared to children who have either one of these alone or to children who have neither. So what I've made 4 points to you. The first is that the health effects of toxic social environments have been difficult to detect because of the extraordinary prevalence of childhood adversities, that 2/3 by the time they're 16 years of age. Secondly, that toxic stressors in childhood are especially prevalent in impoverished families and exert powerful influences on children's physical and mental health. Third, that there are important differences in children's individual susceptibilities to social stressors. And fourth, that there is new evidence for these kind of synergistic, multiplicative effects of physical toxins in the physical environment and social environmental toxins on child development. This is the kind of work that we're pursuing at UCSF to help us understand more about the ways in which the social environment influence growth, development, and health, and trying to understand the ways in which we can prevent those kinds of outcomes that are associated with those kinds of social environmental toxins. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. All right, we're going to invite Drs. Woodruff and Boyce up here. We have somebody with a microphone who's going to walk around. If you put your hand up, we'll call on you and direct questions to Either Tracy or Tom, or both. Don't call on me. I don't know any about this stuff.
That's great. Thank you so much. Those were terrific presentations. I wanted to ask you about the challenges of research on children, because obviously you can't take a certain population of kids and expose them to lead or mercury, and and evaluate. You can't do a double-blind study. So how do you go about obtaining the data that you need to rely on?
Oh my God, that's like my favorite question. Because we think about this all the time. It's such a great point. You can't do randomized controlled trials and expose kids to industrial chemicals, or even really things that are going to adversely affect them. So there's a couple things that we actually have been working on ways. First of all, we do observational human studies. That's a fancy way of saying we observe or collect data on, we're like recruiting pregnant women right now at UCSF. We collect biological samples from the women, we ask them certain questions, and then we look at their pregnancy outcomes, and we're actually going to be following their kids up to a few years of age. So we can look prospectively and control for some of those factors that might be some people think might be explaining the relationship between, for example, a chemical exposure and low birth weight. So that's one way we do it. We also look at animal studies. So we use a lot of, in environmental health, we use animal studies to understand, because there you can do an RCT-like design, right? You can expose the animals, you can look at the effects, you can have a control animal, et cetera. And then we translate those findings into what that means for humans. But there's an interesting thing that has been going on, because if you are familiar in the clinical field, there's evidence-based medicine. So one of the things we're doing is taking those ways to evaluate the quality of evidence and apply that to environmental health, so that we can sort of circumvent this issue around the fact that we don't have RCTs.
And in the social environment, there are also, of course, animal experiments that have been done and that we have learned a great deal from. Experiments, for example, in rats that have shown the effects of removing the mother from the baby rats, the pups, for periods of time, and as a model of maternal deprivation. In rhesus macaques living in natural habitats, there are experiments that have been done with kind of changing the nature of that environment from a psychosocial standpoint. And those have taught us a great deal as well about the response of the young to these perturbations in the social environment. We have a little bit of an advantage with our kids studying these kinds of phenomena, because we can give them tiny doses of challenge and stress in very standardized laboratory circumstances, asking them to do things that are challenging enough to ignite those two stress response systems in the human brain, but not so much that they run out of the room or cry, or, we're very careful to not give them too stressful a circumstance to contend with. But we find dramatic differences between children in how reactive these stress response systems are. So we can measure that in the laboratory, and then bring those measures into the naturally occurring environment of the child and study how naturally occurring stressors are affected by their degree of reactivity that they had in the lab, weeks or months ago. So that's one way that we have tried to understand more about the social environment in young children.
Okay, and question over in this corner here.
Hi, thank you. Have you looked at the environmental toxicity of flying, of being on aircrafts, being in new cars? Because I've heard that, like, for example, new cars or cars are not regulated like buildings are, and so VOC levels could be exponentially higher, and that's okay. We produce those cars, and then also with flying, my son was diagnosed with leukemia when he was 2.5, and I worked in a research company. I was in a biotech firm, and so I'm very was diagnosed at 2.5, and the only thing I can think of is that we flew a lot after he was born. And funnily, I mean, not funnily, but actually during treatment at UCLA, actually, because we started treatment down there, one of the doctors was quizzing his residents on the amount of radiation some of these children are exposed to cranially for certain types of leukemia compared to flying to New York. And I asked him, well, what do you mean? He said, well, if you go up in the sky, you're exposed to solar radiation. And from here, from LA to New York on a round trip direct flight, it was equivalent to 3 adult chest x-rays, he said, in radiation. If you looked at that, and then also, I'm sure they are spraying, you know, the inside cabins heavily with flame retardants, etc.
Tracy, that's a question for you, I think.
So sorry to hear about your son. The first thing is, yes, it's true in cars. Some people have that, oh, I love that new car smell. Well, some of that is from there's actually phthalates that have been measured in cars that kind of come off from that. People have also been looking at so you have the child seats that you put your kids in. So there have been studies showing that, because a lot of the flame retardant laws were focused on using flame retardants in polyurethane foam. And it was somewhat of an artifact of a regulatory standard that was set in the state of California. But because it was in polyurethane foam, then people any application, including childhood car seats, had flame retardants in the polyurethane foam. Now we've seen a shift out of that. A lot of the shift has happened because, I know someone said, oh, your talk is very scary. It's true, but I think if we raise awareness about this issue, so for example, we didn't know that flame retardants were at such high levels being used in the foam. And a lot of advocacy groups made a point of measuring it and then talking about it and then advocating for it. And now you can see flame retardants have been slowly phased out of a lot of different materials, including these childhood car seats. I can't tell you everything that's measured inside a car because I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that there are some of these chemicals that can be found in cars or indoor environments. As for the airplanes, I mean, I know that there is some increase in radiation, but I'm not an expert on what's going on in the airplane. I will say that it is an enclosed cabin, right? And the materials that are used in the airplane, whatever chemicals are used in the construction of those materials can off-gas. And there has been some interest among flight attendants to look at the issues around chemical exposures in airplanes because they work on these, they work on the airplanes consistently. So for example, flight attendants were very instrumental in making bans on smoking in airplanes, right? You can go on an airplane now, nobody smokes. And that was part because the flight attendants were concerned about being exposed to smoking in airplanes. There have been some attempts in the state of California to work with the Flight Attendants Union to do some biomonitoring studies, particularly around flame retardants, but I'm not super familiar if that's gone anywhere, but you would expect because, for example, the cushions have polyurethane foam. There's probably is flame retardant exposure on airplanes, but it's a tricky thing to try and link those, that one thing that was happening in terms of flying on an airplane and something in particular that happened. So.
Could I just ask, is your son doing well? I'm glad to hear that. I just wanted to make one point, which is not about social environments on airplanes, but rather that 30 or 40 years ago when Dr. Duran and I were residents in pediatrics, a small child brought in and diagnosed with leukemia had approximately a 90% chance of mortality. And I'm not a hematologist oncologist, but I believe that at the moment that figure is like 10%. I'm sorry. What I was saying is that the mortality related to leukemia has increasingly gone down over the years. And it wasn't a sudden breakthrough in the understanding of the biology of leukemia. It was a gradual, experimental, iterative kinds of process, the kind of science that's being done every day at UCSF that has resulted in this amazing change just within the lifetime of two elderly pediatricians.
You're not elderly. A quick question. Wonderful talk by both of you. You mentioned the fact that taking physicians and clinicians and scientists to advocate, be it Sacramento, be it City Hall, be it Washington, is really important because we elect these individuals. And you also alluded to the fact that it's a very toxic environment right now, forgive the pun, in politics. But what can individual citizens or family members or concerned parents do? Because I think it really takes all of us to make this better.
I just sorry when you say that, because I often get up in the morning and think, okay, it's not going to get any worse today, but it does feel a little overwhelming at the moment, I think, in terms of our political situation, for sure. But I think so here's what we say to people, because one of the things about talking about these things that we're talking about is it can be very disempowering to talk about them because so much of it is controlled. Some of it's controlled by you, but a lot of it's not controlled by you. So that's why we are advocates of you being an advocate for yourself. And you don't necessarily have to go and fly to Washington, D.C. like we do to go, but you can support people who are being your advocates. And you can support them in any way. You can do anything from joining a local group. You can support UCSF, who I have to say, because I have colleagues, and we both do, at many universities across the United States. And UCSF is by far the most stand-up university in the United States in terms of defending not only science, but even the very other types of human rights things that are going on in the United States. University of California is a big supporter of DACA, right? The Deferred Americans, the DREAM Act, the Dreamers. And UCSF has sued the federal government to try and take away the Dreamers' rights to stay in the United States. That is, well, I also went to UC schools and public institutions. That's really pretty amazing. So I think being a supporter of UCSF is a great way to show your support of these types of things. Being a member of your local community is also another way, and of course voting. Number one thing, we can tell everyone to register and vote. Everyone should register and vote. So you can be involved in any level, but any level of involvement is engagement in the process. So. Oh, sorry.
I want to try to end on a.
Wait. Yeah, we're going to have to keep this brief because we've only got a couple more minutes.
What I want you to say is, are these negative effects reversible?
What did you say?
Reversible.
Oh, reversible. Are they reversible? The negative effects? Yeah, so I'm sorry. You know what, I mean, you told a personal story. I just was going to really talk about this in public too much, but I was telling Dr. Boyce about this because my own son had neurodevelopmental effects when he was young, and it was a challenge. But with a lot of interventions, it is possible that you can see great improvements. He's a college student now, which I wasn't so sure was going to happen when he was in middle school. So yes, I think you can actually do something to ameliorate the effects of some of these diseases, but it does come at some cost. It would be better if we didn't have to do that. But I would say, also, I just want to say too that, even though I talked about how there's a lot of chemicals that are going up in our society, there are some that have gone down. And I talked about that asthma data, which I said, but there was a doubling of asthma. I think this is something that actually people don't know, that asthma is just now, the prevalence of asthma in the United States is just now turned the corner. It's actually slightly started to go down. And you know what else has gone down? Is exposure to a lot of these different criteria air pollutants. We call them smog, ozone, and PM. Those have also gone down too. So it could be that actually when the government took some action, we're now maybe turning the corner on asthma. That, I think, gives us hope for work that we can do in the future. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so punchline, some of this is ameliorable, treatable, but prevention far better than having to deal with improving outcome. Two more questions. One over here.
You touched on regulation in the 70s with removing lead from gasoline, and most recently locally removing flame retardants from furniture. When you kind of forward think this 10 years and you think about the need for regulation, what would be maybe two of the key elements that you would want to see? Is it pesticides? Is it something else?
Well, I think that there's sort of an overarching theme, which is I think we need to move more towards where Europe is in terms of making the manufacturers produce the data so we can understand the safety. But I think two of the areas that we're going to see a lot of movement in is continuing to work on these flame retardants, because there's still flame retardants used in lots of applications, and getting them down. And that kind of group of chemicals which are halogenated, so basically there's a column on the periodic table with a bunch of elements, iodine, bromine, fluorine, chloride, like any chemicals that are in that use those things. I would say that phasing those out would be a high priority in the next future. I would say where the environmental community is going is these Teflon-like perfluorinated chemicals. You'll be hearing a lot about those. There's been a lot of activity around those, and plastics. I think plastics is going to be a hot topic. Sorry.
Okay, one last question. Here we go.
I had a question about behavioral toxins. I know as a parent, we often hear that children are resilient, but I feel that it doesn't always give us, it doesn't always help when you're trying to talk about tough issues such as divorce or death or a cancer diagnosis. And I wondered if you could speak briefly on that topic.
Well, we certainly know that resilience exists, and one way of thinking about those dandelion children, those 80% of kids growing up in our communities, is that they are relatively resilient to the effects of these kind of ambient, relatively prevalent adversities and stressors. There are often in a single family, one child who in my clinical work, I'm often confronted with a family that comes in with 3 or 4 children and says, everybody's doing fine except that one. And those are these kids that we think of as orchid children, who are more sensitive to the effects of the environment, more sensitive to the effects of both the aversive and the supportive aspects of the environment. So the wonderful reversals that can be seen with a child who is struggling with some kind of an adaptation to a toxic stressor, it's wonderful to see how added support, some parental strategies for how to manage that child and encourage that child, for bringing in perhaps extra school help that will help that child with coping with the kinds of things that he or she is dealing with. All of those things are very helpful. We know that some of the generic pieces that are protective of children are that, you know, kids need more than one caretaker. If it's a mom and a grandmother, that's great. If it's 2 parents, that's great. But it's really helpful to kids to have more than just a single caretaker. We know that routines in the life of the child, the kind of regularity and predictability of day-to-day life, is an important asset for a child that's going through a major stressor or adversity. So there are a number of things like that are relatively mundane. They are aspects of family life that we think of as, you know, kind of routine aspects of family life, but they can be very important to these children who are especially sensitive to the effects of those kinds of adversities that you're talking about.
Okay, I'm going to take prerogative of MC and cut this off before we go on for 2 or 3 more hours. I want to thank both Dr. Boyce and Dr. Woodruff for terrific information. So a round of applause. And we also want to thank you. We want to thank you for coming, for sharing this opportunity to learn. I certainly learned a few things today. We thank you for your involvement in improving what we can, doing what we can to improve children's health. So thank you very much.